There's a story about a scientist who opened a sealed glass jar from a museum collection, full of dried moss that had been bone dry for over a century. He added a single drop of water. Within 30 minutes, microscopic animals that had been bone dry for 120 years started crawling around like nothing had happened. That is not a typo, by the way. 120 years without water, without food, without metabolism, and they just woke up. The animal in that jar is called a tardigrade, and the way it cheats death makes it the closest thing to an indestructible creature that life on this planet has ever produced. But this story doesn't start with that museum jar. It starts with what a tardigrade actually is, because once you understand the biology, the rest of what you're about to hear stops sounding like science fiction and starts sounding like the most underrated survival kit in the natural world. A tardigrade is about 0.5 millimeter long, smaller than a grain of salt. They have 8 stubby legs, a barrel-shaped body, and a sort of vacuum cleaner mouth that scientists call a buccopharyngeal apparatus. Their common nickname is the water bear, because under a microscope they kind of waddle like tiny bears in slow motion. You can find them basically everywhere: mountaintops, ocean trenches, the moss growing on the sidewalk outside your apartment. Most people walk past a few thousand of them every single day without ever noticing. Now here's the thing that makes them special. Tardigrades have a survival mode that almost nothing else on Earth can do. When conditions get bad, when the water dries up or the temperature crashes or the air poisons over, they don't try to outrun it. They just stop, completely. They pull their legs in, scrunch their body down into a dehydrated little ball that scientists call a tun, and basically pause being alive. In the tun state, a tardigrade loses more than 95% of its water. Its metabolism drops to less than 1/100% of normal. For all practical purposes, it stops being a living thing when, the way you'd usually define no breathing, no growth, no movement, no measurable chemistry. It just sits there, biologically frozen, waiting for the world to get better. And here's where it gets wild. Because once they're in the tun state, you can do almost anything to them, and they'll survive. Scientists at a biological supply lab called Carolina have documented that anhydrobiotic tuns can withstand temperatures from -272 degrees Celsius, which is colder than the surface of Pluto and within a single degree of absolute zero, all the way up to +151 degrees Celsius, which is hotter than a working oven. That is a temperature range of more than 400 degrees, a range that should pulverize anything biological. Tardigrades just shrug it off. I mean, think about that for a second. The same animal that lives in a puddle on your roof can theoretically survive the temperature of deep space and a pizza oven, depending on the afternoon. And the abuse doesn't stop at heat and cold. Tardigrades have been hit with radiation doses between 3 and 5 kilograms, which is hundreds of times the dose that would kill a human. They come out the other side fine. Scientists at UNC have shown that a huge part of that resistance comes from a protein the tardigrade makes called Dsup, short for damage suppressor. Dsup wraps around the tardigrade's DNA and physically shields it from hydroxyl radicals, which are the tiny molecular wrecking balls that radiation creates inside cells. While the radiation is busy trying to shred the genome, Dsup is sitting on top of the DNA like a bodyguard, absorbing hits. Now, if you're finding any of this even a little bit fascinating, hit the subscribe button. There's a whole channel of stories like this one waiting for you. While Dsup is doing the shielding, the rest of the tardigrade's body is running a second emergency system. Researchers writing in eLife have shown that tardigrades crank up DNA repair genes massively during stress, basically turning their entire cell into a round-the-clock construction crew. So even when damage does get through, repair starts before things can fall apart. They don't avoid getting hurt, they just heal faster than the damage can accumulate. Which brings us to the most absurd experiment ever performed on a multicellular animal. In 2007, the European Space Agency, on a mission called FOTON-M3, did something that sounds like a deleted scene from a sci-fi script. They took dehydrated tardigrades, stuck them on the outside of a satellite, and flew them into orbit. For 10 full days, those tons were exposed directly to the vacuum of space, hard cosmic radiation, and the unfiltered solar UV that would chemically incinerate almost any other animal on the planet. Then they brought them home, dropped them in water, and waited. And no, I'm not making that up. More than 68% of the tardigrades that had been protected from solar UV reanimated within 30 minutes of being rehydrated. Crawling, eating, doing tardigrade things. Animals that had been in literal outer space, dried out, irradiated, and freezing, just woke up like they'd taken a long nap. For a while after that experiment, things in the science world actually seemed pretty calm. There was follow-up research. People wrote papers. the tardigrade became the unofficial mascot of extreme biology. That didn't last. Because once researchers started looking more carefully, the question changed from how tardigrades survive to what tardigrades can teach us. Everything they had figured out was in place. They just didn't know yet what everything was building toward. Which is where the chemistry gets even sneakier. As a tardigrade dries out, it doesn't just sit there hoping for the best. It pumps full of two specific molecules. The first is trehalose, a kind of sugar that essentially replaces water inside the cells, propping up the structure of proteins and membranes so they don't collapse without their normal hydration. The second is glycerol, which acts like a biological antifreeze. Together, they turn the inside of the tardigrade into something closer to a sugary, syrupy glass than a normal living tissue. Glass doesn't crack the same way ice does. Glass doesn't ferment. Glass just waits. That's the kind of trick that makes biochemists jealous. The shape of the ton matters too. By pulling its legs in and squishing into that compact ball, a tardigrade reduces the surface area of its body so dramatically that water evaporation is slowed by up to 1,000-fold. Combine that with the trehalose, the glycerol, the Dsup protein, and the upgraded DNA repair, and what you have is not really one survival trick. It's a stacked system, where every layer covers for the weaknesses of the layer underneath. Which finally brings us back to that museum jar. The dried moss in that jar had been sitting on a shelf in a museum collection for more than a century, with no light, no air exchange worth mentioning, no humidity, no source of food. Anything we'd normally call alive should have been dust a long time ago. But moss is exactly the kind of microhabitat tardigrades love, because when the moss dries out, the tardigrades in it go into the tune state right alongside it. They get filed away on a shelf, paused, basically waiting in line for someone to come back and finish the experiment 120 years later. When that scientist added water, he was unknowingly hitting a reset button on biology itself. The trehalose dissolved, the glycerol thinned out, the proteins refolded, the Dsup protein let go, the DNA repair machinery quietly fired back up, and tiny eight-legged passengers, who had been on the slowest possible commute through time, just walked off the train like nothing had happened. So if you ever feel like the universe is fragile, like life only works when conditions are perfect, remember that somewhere in a museum drawer right now, there is probably a chip of dried moss containing a population of microscopic animals that are technically biological time travelers. They have outlasted world wars, ice ages in miniature, vacuum, radiation, and the simple, brutal passage of years. All they need is a drop of water and the right phone call. If you found this fun, there are more stories like this one on the channel. See you in the next video.